Hey guys, my name's Alisha and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in February, and I had a really great reading month this month, and I read some absolutely new favorites and some books, that I really wasn't expecting a lot from that just blew me away. So without further ado, let's get into it. So at the very second that I'm filming this video, I have finished 10 books and I'm in the middle of 3 books, and there's I think like 2 or 3 days left in February, so I'm hoping to finish all of those 3, but I feel like I'll definitely finish at least 2 of those books. But for the purposes of this wrap up, I'm going to talk about all 13 of these books. And the genres that I've read 4 sci-fi fantasy books, 3 romance books, 2 thrillers, 2 nonfictions, 1 horror, and 1 contemporary. So definitely, a lot of diverse books, a lot of variety, which is what I like to see. I think last month I was in like a very romance reading mood, and this month I fell off of that and I'm in my like fantasy time, so we love to see that. And yeah, let's see what those books were. To start off, I have My Sweet Girl by Amanda Jayatissa, I believe is how you pronounce it. And this is a adult thriller book. It is basically about this woman who grew up in the Sri Lankan orphanage. She is Sri Lankan, and when she, I think it's like 11 or 12, she gets adopted by these American people, these Californians, and she gets taken from the orphanage in Sri Lanka to America and basically grows up in America. But now when she is older, I think she's in her 20s or maybe almost 30, she basically is living with a roommate, and suddenly her roommate dies and she ends up stumbling across his body, and we find out that actually her roommate was sort of blackmailing her about this secret that he found out, and so she was supposedly had gone to get some money to kind of quiet him down, and so when she comes back to her apartment she finds him dead. And we're basically following 2 different timelines. The first one is of her as a child in Sri Lanka, and then the second one is kind of current day, what's all happening. And we see how her past kind of catches up to her in her present and has a very big impact on everything that's been happening. So I was really intrigued by this story and this premise, and I thought it, had a lot of potential to be really interesting and really great. And although I really liked some parts of this, I wasn't as on board with sort of like the thriller and mystery parts of it, and I do think the first half of the book was really slow, and it really took a while to ramp things up and the actual story to start. But I did really like the representation and the kind of cultural aspects, because especially in the first timeline where we're following this girl in Sri Lanka, we do really see, like, there's a lot of elements, I think, of Sri Lankan culture and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. But overall, I gave this book 3 stars because I do, like I said, I think there was really interesting parts, but also some things that could have been better. But yeah, this is a pretty decent thriller. Then next I read In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and this is a nonfiction book, and it is about, it's a memoir about this woman who basically is just talking about this abusive relationship she had as a queer woman. So she was in a lesbian relationship, and her partner was very kind of emotionally and psychologically abusive to her, as well as physically abusive. And so basically this book is following her, like her telling her story about everything that happened and really shining a light on abuse in queer relationships. And I thought that was really important because I feel like in general queer stories and queer love and everything is seen in this very sweet and great light. And while it is, obviously love is love and like all of that is important, that representation, abuse does happen in all relationships, and not all, in like any relationship, and you never know. So I think this was important in shedding light on that whole topic. And I do really like how the story was written. I think the writing was really beautiful and really easy to read in a way, because despite being a nonfiction book, I do think this book kind of read like a fictional book. It wasn't as much of like telling, this is like what I went through. It was more of like painting a picture for us, and also it was told in like these kind of vignette stories. So we got like each chapter was kind of a different moment or a different experience, and it was told in this like just this really beautiful way. And so for me personally, like I do think that was really beautiful and an interesting choice on how to write this book. But for me personally, the what I didn't like about that part was that it felt kind of like everything was out of place, because we were very much jumping from like different times in her life and different moments, and we're going back and forth and like, you know, a lot farther, and then we jump back to like her as a younger person and things like that. And also some of these stories were very like metaphorical, and while I think again like it writing wise was really beautiful, in terms of the story I don't think I personally grasped as much as I could have if it was told in a different way. But I mean, I definitely like respect her for how she chose to tell her story, and again I think it was really important to tell this specific story. And I don't really want to rate the book because it is nonfiction, and I don't think it's fair to, you know, rate how somebody is writing or how they're deciding to tell their own story. So I'm not gonna rate it, but there were some things that I really loved and some things that I think story-wise just could have been told differently. So then I read Jade City by Fonda Lee, and this is a pretty popular adult urban fantasy book, and I have been so excited to read this book because I've just heard so many great things about it, and honestly it feels like everybody who reads this book really loves it. And unfortunately for me, I didn't love it. I ended up giving this book 3 stars, and this was a book that I think, like maybe because it was urban fantasy, and I mean I haven't really read a lot of urban fantasy, but I do think it might be just a subgenre that I don't really like it might just be because of that. So also I think in terms of, well, okay, basically what this book is about is this following this family who, this specific family are able to, through kind of like rigorous training, wield this magical property called jade. And they are kind of, this family, this clan, they're kind of the political powerful people in this city called Kikon, but they are in conflict with this other clan family who is basically trying to take the power from them. And we are really following 3 characters who are all siblings and part of the, I think they're the Call family, so the first clan. And so we're following, I believe, Hyler or Hilo, Lan, and Shay. And so it's very much, this book is about kind of like political intrigue and like strategy, and just very much about the politics of war and how these 2 different families and like clans are just really doing the strategic things to get at each other and like take power from each other. So it's very much this like power struggle between these 2 families. So in terms of, again, the premise sounds really cool and really interesting, but for me, I think what really dropped this book for me was the characters. So I just really didn't connect or care about any of the characters, and like I said, we're following 3 kind of main characters, and there are a few other characters kind of sprinkled in, but I mean, they were really different and unique. But it was just something about, I guess, like the story or maybe the writing that I just didn't really click with the characters. And for me, who, like, I'm definitely a character focused person, like I really need the characters to stand out and like capture my attention in a book to really like it. And yeah, like I really couldn't tell you why, but there's something that with these characters that just didn't work for me. But I do think in terms of the world building and the whole like magical fantasy part of the book, that was really cool. And you can clearly tell, you know, Fonda Lee really thought out this world and the story and how everything works. So I definitely like really loved that. But I also thought like I think it was interesting because the jade, that this like magical thing that like gives these people powers and stuff, it really like felt like it was this, in like in our world, it could just be this like really dangerous street drug. The jade magic is basically really rare and only a specific group of people can properly wield it, because you have to go through this like crazy amounts of training and like all of this stuff. And so throughout the book, we're seeing how these regular people who sort of can't, you know, wield this magic are trying to use it, but like it's not safe for them. And so yeah, that just really reminded me of like I don't know, like a really dangerous street drug. And so I feel like in that way, it kind of sort of like represents reality and like you know, had like these realistic elements in terms of like what this magical thing or like, you know, drug is capable of and how it can like make people like really intense and like crazy in a way, and you know, cause addictions and cause people to do bad things and stuff like that. So I thought that was a really interesting take. But yeah, overall 3 stars, because while the world building and fantasy side of things I really enjoyed, I didn't really like the characters. So then I read my first 5-star of the month, and that is Girl One by Sarah Flannery Murphy. And this is just one of the coolest books I've read. This is a science fiction sort of book. It's like a science fiction mixed with like thriller, mixed with romance, and it just has so much of everything. And I had such a fun time with this. I was really like not expecting anything when I picked this book up because I haven't really heard anything about this book. But this basically is a world where scientists have figured out a way to basically produce life with only a female's DNA. So you don't need sperm and you don't need like Y chromosomes and like a male's DNA. And so this one scientist basically did these experiments in the 70s where he produced 9 lives of these girls who were only made from their mother's DNA. And so these girls ended up being basically like copies of their mothers because they had like 100% of their mother's DNA. And so we are actually following Girl One, who is the first girl who was kind of made from these experiments. And this all is taking place in the 1990s. And basically what happens is that when all of these girls were younger, in the 70s, the sort of place where all of these experiments was happening was there was a lot of people kind of against these experiments and thought it was like inhumane and like that kind of thing. And so the homestead, which was the place where the experiments were happening and like all of these girls grew up, like the first few years of their life, they grew up on this homestead. So at the time, there was basically a fire that blew up the homestead, and one of the girls died, as well as the scientists who created all of this died. The rest of them got away and basically spread out throughout America to kind of live their lives and get away from the spotlight and the attention and just have like normal lives. In present day, we're now following Girl One, who, again, like I said, is the first girl made from these experiments. And so she's a bit like kind of estranged from her mother, and she hasn't seen her mother for a year because she's in med school, and her kind of goal is to recreate what that scientist created when he made her. And she kind of sees him as her like a father figure, and she wants to make him proud and kind of continue the work that he had started. So basically, yeah, she hasn't talked to her mother in a while, but she suddenly finds out in the news that her home, where her mother still was, is like basically burnt down, and now her mother is missing. She ends up, you know, going back home and now kind of starting this whole journey of trying to figure out what actually happened to her mother and where she is. And she is sort of like a road trip story because she meets this journalist who apparently her mother was in contact with, and he has some answers but not a lot. And so she and him kind of team up, and they decide that they're gonna go to like across America and try to find all of the other girls and their mothers and see if they know anything. And so along the way, we, as the main character, goes and meets all these different girls and their mothers who are also part of this experiment. We meet them, and we also pick up a couple of the girls on the way, and they join kind of this journey. And yeah, it's just this road trip, and they're off to try to find the main character's mother. So like I said, there's like that science fiction element where, you know, it's like these experiments and this like crazy stuff happening, and then it's also this sort of like mystery thriller stuff because her mother is missing and we're trying to figure out what happened to her mother. And then there's just so much like character stuff, and it has a lot of different elements, and I think that's what made the book so interesting, was because like I was never bored reading this book. It held my attention from page 1 to the very end. So next I read People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, and this is a really popular romance book, and I had read Beach Read by the same author previously, and I didn't really like that book, but with this book I actually really liked it. And I think because I maybe had lower expectations because I knew I didn't like her other work, I wasn't really expecting much. But yeah, I really liked this book, and it really surprised me. This is basically a friends to lovers romance, and I don't really read a lot of that. It's not a big trope that I like, But I think this was done really well because our two main characters, Alex and Poppy, have been friends since like college, and every year they end up going on this vacation. And where the book starts, basically these two characters haven't really spoken in I think like a year or two, so it's been a while. But Poppy basically hits up Alex and she's like, let's go on one more vacation together and, you know, kind of rekindle this friendship. And so we basically are following them as they reconnect and go on this vacation in present time. And then we're also getting flashbacks of their time as being friends and going on these vacations over the years. And so what I really enjoyed is that the way that Emily Henry kind of built up their friendship and that connection before going into the romance and, you know, making things romantic, I think was done really well. And I mean, I personally don't think it was slow or boring reading about them being friends. And I also did like the kind of transition into even like before when they realize they have feelings for each other more than just friends and how that kind of played out. So yeah, overall I really did like this book and ended up giving it 4 stars, which honestly is really high for me with romance books because it is really hard for me to truly love a romance book. So yeah, this one's definitely pretty high up on my list. So next I read Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. And this is a really short novella and it's a horror book, and it was such a weird and interesting book, and I like was pretty blown away by like how intricate everything was, despite being like, I think it's like 100, definitely less than 150 pages, so it's really short. So I mean, this author really put a lot into every single page. But I ended up giving this 3 stars, maybe 3.5, only because it's a bit of a lose-lose situation in my eyes, because the way that this book is, it kind of had to be super short to do what the author intended to do, in my opinion. And for me though, I definitely think if it were longer and I was able to, you know, sit with the characters more and like the world more and the story more, it maybe would have been better. But then I think, you know, if she had made it longer, she wouldn't have been able to do what she did with the book. So yeah, like I don't necessarily want it to be longer, but I think because it was so short, I couldn't love it as much as I wanted to. But this is basically about this woman who is living this like idyllic life, this ideally in this perfect world, and she is a wife and she lives in this like beautiful neighborhood and she kind of gets everything she wants. Her husband is so great and, you know, her life is just so great. But then slowly she basically starts to find some things that are really weird and is kind of messing with her perception of this beautiful, perfect life that she has. And so we basically follow her as she slowly unravels different secrets and stuff that's going on. This really reminded me of WandaVision. If you've read this book, not because of like the plot, because I mean that goes in a completely different direction, but just because WandaVision, if you watch that, it is, you know, we're following Wanda and Vision in this perfect little neighborhood and life, and we, as the viewers, slowly see that like things are not as they seem, and like that's perfectly what happens in this book. So yeah, completely different outcomes, but I just thought that like that was an interesting kind of comparison. Then next I read Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto, and this is another 5 stars, and I love this book so much. It was so funny and so cute and so much fun. This is basically a romance mystery. Like, we're following this young woman who gets set up on this blind date by her mother, and she has no idea about who this guy is or anything about him, but she ends up going on this date, and one thing leads to another, and she ends up accidentally killing this guy. And so rather than, you know, go to the police and turn herself in, she ends up going home to her mother and her aunties, and she tells them what happens, and her family is like, don't you worry, we got your back and we're gonna help you deal with this situation. And then we're basically just following like this comedy of errors as this whole family tries to get rid of this body and deal with everything. That's like the general gist of it, but there's definitely a sort of like second chance romance that's at the heart of this book, because our main character, due to certain reasons, had to break up with her boyfriend, and she ends up running into him during all of this craziness, and their romance sort of rekindles. And so I just had so much fun with this book. If you want a book that is just, you know, gonna make you laugh and make you have a good time, definitely read this book. Next, I read Yolk by Mary H.K. Choi, and this book is definitely on the sadder side. This is following two sisters who are kind of like estranged. They don't really talk, they're not really close, but the younger sister finds out that her older sister has cancer. And so she kind of becomes, because of this situation, she gets really close to her sister and ends up seeing her sister and her mother and father in a different light. And we're basically just following this main character as she is navigating kind of her feelings with this news and just dealing with her life. And so this book was really heavy, I think. Like, there was a lot of very intense topics, you know, obviously trigger warnings for cancer, and then our main character is also going through some personal stuff, so I would say trigger warnings for like eating disorders and body dysmorphia, depression, things like that. So definitely like look into the triggers before reading the book. But overall, this book was just really beautiful and like really beautifully written. And as a sister, there was a lot of things that were really relatable. And I personally have like a really good relationship with my sister, so I didn't relate to that stuff. But I think just in general, like if you have a sibling and, you know, this book might make you tear up, honestly. Like there is definitely a lot of stuff in here that just is about, you know, this sisterly bond and this connection, and I definitely feel that like with my sister, that, I mean, no matter what, like even if I one day stopped talking to her and was super mad at her, you know, I would be there for her, and I know she would be there for me. And so yeah, this book does a really great job of just showcasing the sisterly bond and how much love there is between siblings. So I really did love that. I gave this book, I think, like 4 stars, maybe 3.5, only because I did think it was a little on the slower side, and which, not my favorite thing, but like this story, basically we're just following the main character kind of deal with her life and her personal struggles and things like that, and there wasn't a lot of like action or story, I guess, so it was a bit slower. And then also for me personally, there's like a bit of a romance in this book, and I just didn't really care for it. Like, I personally don't even think it was necessary for the book. I much rather would have just liked to see the sisters like getting closer and bonding, as well as our main character who has a bit of a difficult relationship with her mother and her father. And so I don't know, I cared much more about the kind of family stuff rather than the romance stuff. So yeah, so 3.5, 4 stars, but definitely a really, really great book. Then next I read In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead, and this is an adult thriller, and it is one of my favorite thrillers of all time. This was so good. And you know, this is not like the best thriller, it's not the best mystery, it's like not the best really anything, but just something about it that you cannot put it down once you start. It is so good. It is just so interesting and so action-packed, and all of the characters are so unique and so interesting, and I loved it. But basically, this is about a group of friends who are about to go to their college reunion, and when they were in college, one of the people in the friend group was killed. And another person in the friend group was basically thought to be the murderer, even though he wasn't ever convicted. And so now we're following these group of friends, and there's really only like 6 of them, even though we started with 8. This group of friends ends up going to the college reunion, where a character ends up coming in and kind of deciding he's going to figure out the murder and what actually happened that night. So he kind of corners all of these people, and he's like, we're getting to the bottom of this. And so that's happening, and then we're also getting flashbacks of all of these characters' time in college and like how they met and little secrets along the way that kind of has gotten them to the point that they are now. And like what I really loved about this book, it's definitely like a whodunit sort of mystery, because what was done so well, I think, is how each character in this friend group has like really like complicated stuff going on, and there's so many secrets and like hidden stuff that even like they don't know about each other. And so it really makes it so that, you know, any of these people could have murdered the person who was killed. And so throughout the book, you are constantly like, oh, it could have been this person for this reason or this person for this other reason, and you don't really know. But I did guess beforehand, you know, who the murderer was, and I think it might be easy for some people to guess, but I personally don't think that took away from the book itself. Like, I think it was still a really interesting and fun thriller mystery. In terms of everything put together, it's just one of the best thrillers I've ever read, so 5 stars for sure. So the last book that I have finished reading is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, and this is a adult fantasy book that is truly like as if a, you know, warm blanket has wrapped you up and you are just floating in clouds. Like, this book is so sweet and fluffy and beautiful and heartwarming, and it made me like tear up at certain points. It made me like laugh out loud, and it made me feel so many great emotions. So I truly love this book. This is basically following a man named Linus Baker, who is a bit of a loner, and he is a stickler for rules, and you know, he's just this very like follow the rules kind of guy. And he works for this company called Daikami, which basically is a company that goes to different orphanages and checks on the children in those orphanages and basically decides if they should continue to take in children and if, you know, things are safe for them, things like that. And it's also like this fantasy world where there are like magical creatures and things like that, but it's very like light fantasy. Other than the actual like magical creatures, there wasn't actual like magic. So if you're not like a heavy fantasy reader, I think you'll definitely like that part of it. But basically Linus, because he's such a stickler for rules, he ends up getting sent by extremely upper management to go to this island where it's a bit of a dangerous situation, supposedly, because of the children who are in this specific orphanage. And so he ends up being sent there to write this really thorough case report of what is actually going on and if this orphanage is safe and good and should still be open. When Linus gets there, he realizes that the children in this orphanage are actually just regular children, even though there are some of the children, one of them is the Antichrist, and one of them is a gnome. One of them is a magical creature called, I think, like a sprite or something. And so all of these different children have these kind of negative connotations that society has put on them. And so because of that, they are seen as really dangerous and bad, and people are kind of scared of them. So what this book really, I think, is about is just kind of acceptance, because a lot of the stuff in this book is dealing with like prejudices and discrimination and hate and things like that. But I think what TJ Klune was trying to do is create a world where, you know, people are accepted and people aren't kind of judged on things they can't control, but rather like who they are as a person and on the inside. And there's also a really cute love story between Linus and the sort of caretaker of the orphanage, Arthur. And I loved the whole love story part too, because it was so like organic and so sweet, and most of it pretty much is a slow burn, because for most of the book it's just like little subtle moments between the two until we get to like them actually having a romance. So I really love that. And overall, this is definitely 5 stars and one of my favorites of the year for sure. But I also would like to mention that this book does have a bit of a controversy around it, because recently, I think like a year ago or something, the author did an interview where he talked about the inspiration behind the book, which was that the 60s scoop in Canada, where Indigenous people, their children, were forcibly taken from their homes and put into residential schools. And these schools were basically created to kind of erase Indigenous people's culture and their identity and their language and assimilate them into like Western European culture and standards. And so they were like forcibly taken, and they were treated really badly in these schools. And I believe like the end goal of the schools was that these children would get adopted by white people and like basically just completely erase their true identities. And so as a Canadian myself, I definitely have learned a lot in school about residential schools and like this whole experience. And it is something that is like really traumatic, and is actually something that like it's not like a really, you know, historical thing or that it's in the past, because I think the last residential school closed in like the late 1990s. And so obviously there are a lot of Indigenous people who are still reeling from the effects of this whole situation, and there are adults who were in residential schools, and like those people are still alive and like traumatized by that situation and everything that they went through. So I think like rightfully so, a lot of people have criticized TJ Klune for kind of co-opting this trauma and exploiting this event that Indigenous people went through. And I personally, as not an Indigenous person, I don't think my opinion or voice on the situation matters. So I definitely think, you know, people need to do research and listen to the people whose voices do matter on this topic. And, you know, while I objectively think the book was written beautifully and had really beautiful characters and was a great story, I definitely think it's important and necessary to look at this side of things and understand that, you know, this book is a little problematic of like TJ Klune's inspiration and what he's based this book on. Because in a way, what he's done is take a really traumatic and horrifying and devastating situation and kind of put this like fluffy fantasy spin on it. And in a way, I think that does kind of invalidate the experiences that Indigenous people went through and are still going through by just, he's kind of like sprinkled this like fun, fluffy, like stuff on top of this really traumatizing story and profited from that. So I definitely think that, you know, TJ Klune as an author needs to realize what he's done and listen to the criticisms and the concerns that Indigenous people have and like really take that into account, you know, and hopefully as an author he has grown from the situation and, you know, is like understanding this negative feedback. So yeah, just wanted to mention the controversy, and I will try to link some stuff down below where like Indigenous people are talking about this and other voices are being heard. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. And I'm quickly just going to talk about the 3 books that I'm still in the middle of because like I said, I haven't finished them, so I don't have like full opinions on them. But the first is The Other Me by an author that I don't think I can pronounce the name of, so I'm just going to put up the picture here. And this is a sort of science fiction book. It's like an alternate reality where this woman ends up walking through this door and enters into a whole different version of her life. So, you know, she's still the same person and she actually has memories of that like past life, like her real life, but she is now put into this situation where she is like married to this guy she knew in high school and she like has a completely different job and different friends and lives in a different city and things like that. And so we're basically following her as she tries to figure out what has happened to her and like how she got put into this life. And her husband, who she's now married to, there is something kind of off about him and she thinks like he might know what actually happened. So she doesn't really trust anybody and we're basically just following her, trying to figure out what happened. And so I'm currently like a little less than 50% of the way through this book, and although I really like the start of it and I think again like the premise is really interesting, I have kind of gotten less and less interested as the book has gone on, and I mean that's not a great thing. So I'm most probably gonna finish it, but I'm feeling at the moment that this is probably not gonna be more than 3 stars, but we'll see. And then next I'm in the middle of Delilah Green Doesn't Care by, I'm forgetting the author's name, so I'll have the picture up as well. But this is a adult romance and it has a sapphic relationship. It's basically following a woman who is sort of estranged from her family, her stepmother and her stepsister, because she was basically neglected when she was a child when her father died and she was put in the care of her stepmother. And so when she turned 18, she left home right away and she really hasn't stayed in contact with her family back home. And so now her stepsister is getting married and her stepmother has basically sort of roped her into being the photographer because she herself is a photographer. And so she comes back home and is basically following her sister and her friends around through all of these like wedding activities. And so the romance is between her and one of her sister's friends. And so I definitely think I've really been enjoying the dynamic between the main character and her stepsister because I feel like there's a lot to unpack there. They have this really kind of antagonizing relationship and I feel like there's a lot of kind of misunderstandings and like things that went down in their childhood that has caused this sort of rift between them. So I think it'll be really interesting to see them sort of like reconnect and become sisters if that's the direction we're going in. In terms of the romance, however, I think it's good, but I think I'm not going to give anything away, but there's sort of like this specific reason that the main character is kind of chasing after the girl, and I'm not fully on board with that whole situation. So although, I mean, I think the romance is cute and like I'm giving it a chance, I don't necessarily love how it started. But I mean, this book has the potential, I think, to be 4 stars, but it's feeling more like a 3.5. But again, we'll see. And then lastly, I am almost finished So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. So this is a nonfiction book, obviously talking about race and racism. And I have, like, while reading this, I'm constantly like nodding along and totally like believe in everything this author is talking about, because as a person of color, like a woman of color, I definitely like relate to so many instances in this book, and like her talking about racism and how like the systemic racism and the problems it causes, and discrimination, and opportunities that women of color and people of color don't have, and the consequences of that. There's a lot of things that I definitely relate to, and a lot of things that I'm also just learning and realizing and understanding. And I also really like the way that this book is written, because the author writes it in a way that's just very kind of readable, if that makes sense. So like, again, with nonfiction books, sometimes it feels like it kind of can alienate readers, because there'll be like really big words, and like the way that things are written feel a little convoluted. But this book doesn't do that. It's written really simply. It's basically the author talking about specific instances in her life, and like different situations, and what she kind of took away from that and understood, and kind of telling us as the readers. So yeah, I think this book is like really easy to read, and honestly something that I think all people should read, because whether it's like something you relate to, or it's something that you're going to learn from and help you to understand people, I think it's really important. And it's obviously Black History Month, and so I definitely wanted to try to read something that is focused on Black people and their experiences, and racism and the things that they go through, so that I could better understand that. So yeah, I definitely really love this, and this is, again, I don't rate nonfiction really, but if I did, it would definitely be 5 stars already, and I'm not even halfway through it. So yeah, those are all 13 books that I have either finished or I'm hopefully gonna finish this month. And if you have read any of them, let me know what you thought of them. And thanks guys for watching, and I will see you next time.